What's up everyone? Bunny Operator here. Welcome back to the channel. This will be part 3 of the AR15 Primer Series, discussing optics and sighting options. As you can see, I have an assortment of scopes, red dots, holographic sights, mounts, optics in general. And the plan today is to discuss general concepts for determining which optic best suits your needs, the mounts associated with it, whether or not you need iron sights. We're going to go ahead and get started. I'm going to pull a bunch of these items off and we'll go from there. You might recall from my previous videos that I recommend finding a photo of an AR15 on the internet that you want your particular build to look like, and use that photo as a roadmap towards assembling or putting together your rifle itself. Afterwards, you have to determine what you intend to use the rifle for, whether it be primarily bench or target shooting or long range distance shooting, whether it be precision or practical accuracy, or if you intend to use the rifle for more close end or close to mid range. All that matters, because what one type does for one direction will not necessarily be ideal for the other direction. And what I mean by that is, if you have a magnified optic, let's say a high power 4 to 12 or beyond that, it's a lot more difficult to do one power shooting at close range, let's say 20 yards and under, just because the amount of magnification makes it more difficult for you to clearly see the target, or at least to track the target at those distances. That being said, we're gonna go ahead and start shifting towards iron sights to begin with. That's generally the ground level. Whether or not you want iron sights will be totally up to you and totally dependent on how you intend to use your rifle. For the most part, if we're talking about using iron sights primarily as your aiming method, then a lot of these will essentially go out the door. And frankly, even the folding sights like this will go out the door, and you would want something of the fixed iron sight variety, whether it be on a carry handle style upper receiver like this, granted less the optic, where your iron sights are physically fixed into the receiver set, along with a fixed front sight base like this as your primary aiming device. Or you can opt for fixed iron sights that are mounted to the top end of your receiver set like this style. I don't have a rear sight to show you. I don't have fixed rear sights, but know that that's out there. Now, should you want to mount an optic, you'll have to determine the proper height that you want your optic to reside in relation to the iron sights in order for you to what's known as co-witness through your optics itself. So for example, if this optic is up, and we'll say their rear sight is also up, then the window when viewing both your iron sights and your optic will be in line. Now, there are two different types for this. There is absolute co-witness, which means that the center of your dot, or in this case, your holographic reticle on the EOTech, are directly in line with your iron sights. Meaning, if you look into your iron sights, then your reticle itself, or the dot, should be in perfect alignment with your iron sights. Lower 1/3 means that your iron sights sit a little bit lower in the viewing window of the optic. You see, I just kind of moved my sights down a little bit, and it offers you a little bit more clear window when you're using your optic, but the iron sights are there. You just have to shift your cheek welt down a little bit in order to see your iron sights. I'll go ahead and roll in a photo of the two different sight pictures. That'll be totally up to you to decide. For this style of sighting picture, my preference is lower 1/3, because I would prefer to have a more clear open window such as this versus in a slightly more occluded window. Now, that sight height option also applies to red dots as well as holographics, but they do not necessarily work with scopes because, well, scopes for the most part, they're long bodied, and your rear sight in general is typically tucked under the rear of your scope like this. But your front sight is usually way out in front, and you can leave it up as a reference point when you're low power variable optic like this EOTech Vudu. Then you can see the front post and use it as a reference point for your reticle, assuming that you're using the scope in that fashion. But at higher magnification, when you crank up the power, in this case at 6 power, you will not see the front sight anymore. So that being said, when you use a fixed front sight with this style of optic, that same principle applies. You can see the front sight at 1x, but at higher magnification, that sight is gone. So you have to determine if that's something that you particularly want for your setup. Me personally, I do tend to have iron sights or backup iron sights when I'm running LPVOs or low power variable optics like this. But in some cases, depending on the rifle itself, if it's a dedicated scope gun, then I will completely omit the iron sights altogether. Now that we have the absolute co-witness and the lower 1/3 settings out of the way, you also have the option for even taller sights depending on what you're doing. For example, this particular Scalarworks mount is a 1.93 height, which means it sits at approximately the height where you want your optic to clear night vision. Let's say you have a PEC 15 or the civilian equivalent up front. Well, typically at lower 1/3 heights or even absolute co-witness heights, the box of the night vision device itself will occlude your optic window. And with the 1.93 and even 1.97 heights out there, it tends to clear the height of the night vision device. And that's something you have to consider if you want that or not. Just note that on the 1.7 and the 1.93 heights, it's not tall enough and you actually lose your iron sights in this case. So a dedicated night vision gun using this height of an optic mount will not benefit from having iron sights. Moving on from there, we have Unity Tactical's 2.26 height, which physically sits higher than the 1.93 and still affords you built-in iron sights. So what Unity Tactical has done is essentially mimicked the carry handle height. And what carry handle height optics are designed to do is they sit on top of the carry handle, but at the same time, you can still see through the rear and use your iron sights along with your front sight base or fixed front sight or however you're doing it. So it affords you the optic plus backup irons, and they're all built in. And Unity Tactical's design mimics that, but in a smaller package using modern optics. So their particular mount itself has a rear sight and front sight option. In this case here, the rear sight is built in from factory. You can still remove it, but the box itself also comes with a front sight that you can screw into the bottom and it will appear here. Granted, your sight radius is about 2.5 inches or so, and that's pretty short. But what I've done is I've paired it with the Scalarworks fixed front sight that I have on my Radiant upper, and I'll bring that in here. So this is the Scalarworks fixed front sight, and what I've done in this example is I've left the rear sight on, as I noted before, and once the optic is mounted, it essentially sits like this. So I have the tall carry handle mount to clear night vision optics should I want that, or just for a more neutral heads-up display versus a cheek weld. I have more of a chin weld. I can still duck down and use my iron sights. So that is the benefit of the Unity system, and I like it a lot. That being said, the two examples of the carry handles that I have, the A1 and A2 setups, mimic that, and I do like those examples because particularly for those systems, I'm using very particular optics to mount on top, and I try to be careful with it because a lot of the modern optics don't have options to mount on top of carry handle without adding a weight penalty to it, or a much higher weight penalty than normal. The Unity system reduces the overall weight of it in a much smaller package. But I like the carry handle systems, so I'm choosing to run these and test them out myself. Now, this Trijicon RX06 is very old. It's an older design, antiquated. It is fiber optic and tritium. You see the front here. This is where the fiber optic tube sits, and it sort of wraps around. Now, that being said, this optic is absolutely terrible when indoors. It only works when bright daylight is outside and there's light hitting the fiber optics themselves. It's currently a placeholder right now, and I'm waiting for prism optics to show up, and we'll get into prisms in a second. On the A2, I'll be running a similar system, but using an Aimpoint Pro or an Aimpoint Patrol rifle optic. And this is an older design, but still used today. It is basically a bigger version of the Aimpoint T2 styles, but in more of a robust system like this. You can see it looks similar to what was used in the 90s and 2000 era during Desert Storm, or in some cases you'll see Black Hawk Down. They'll use tubular style optics like this. Granted, this is the non-military version. You will see this optic on a lot of police agency guns. There is a civilian version called the ACO, and I'll link a photo here. The primary difference is that the Pro has night vision settings while the ACO doesn't. There's a few other things like battery life, but that's the major primary difference between the two. And it's up to you to decide which one you want. Both are roughly around the same price, the ACO being a little bit cheaper, but I'd say get what's available to you. With that information out of the way, we'll go ahead and get to the nitty-gritty of which you should decide on, whether it be a red dot like these, or a holographic sight, or a scope, or low-power variable optic like this. For the current purpose, we're going to assume that most of us are going to be running close range to mid-range usage of our AR-15s. For long-range examples, it's usually going to be higher magnification, and a lot of this won't necessarily imply. But note that if you're going to do long-range shooting, you would probably want the lowest height rings or mount or scope mount that you can use for the optic, because you want a more consistent cheek weld. Going any higher than that will make it a little bit more difficult for you to maintain a more consistent sight picture. And with anything that's magnified, you want the same cheek weld every single time in order to maintain consistency. So what I have in front of you here are examples of red dots up here and holographic sights on the bottom. Both of these are EOTechs. These two are Aimpoints. This one is a Holosun, but mimicking the Aimpoint micro. Why would you choose one over the other? Well, that's up to personal preference. There are benefits to holographic sights. There are also benefits to red dot systems like this. At the same time, there are cons to both of them. Many other channels out there cover this in depth, so I'm just going to give you a brief crash course so that you can have a general guide in your selection process. All of these optics here are parallax free. Parallax refers to the reticle or dot shift when your eyes are not perfectly in alignment with the optic. For example, the EOTechs being holographic, and including the red dots are like that too. They just have different technology. But essentially, the EOTechs, no matter how you look through them, as your head is moving back and forth, the reticle itself will always be on target, assuming that it's zeroed correctly. So that makes it very beneficial when you're shooting from unusual positions or when you're quickly bringing up the rifle onto target, but you're not in perfect alignment with the optic. So that's a great option, and it's very fast for close range shooting. Red dots in this style also offer that benefit. However, there is a much smaller window of opportunity for you to acquire that dot. So one of the benefits to the EOTech is the larger field of view, and the downside to these tube style red dots is the smaller field of view. But the pro to this style optic is it uses a CR2032 battery, which lasts approximately 5 years in this particular setup, while the EOTech uses a CR123A battery, which does not last very long. So it's the technology behind the optics themselves and what type of batteries they use. In this case, the EOTechs being holographic, they use an actual laser that projects the image onto the screen itself. While on the red dots, there is an LED emitter on the inside of the tube, and that is what is used to project the dot onto the lens for you to see. Of course, weight is also a factor between these two particular examples. Once you get into this category of tubular style red dots, then the weights are not that much different, and you still run into the same tube effect as with this one, but you gain a lot more robustness. Granted, the Aimpoint T2 is bomb-proof, as well as any of these options here. I'm not too particularly sure about the Holosuns. They're kind of a new maker on the market, and there's just not enough intel on them being used out in the field in order to confirm. We're going to move towards explaining specific example variances of these particular optic choices themselves. For the EOTechs, these two are the EXPS2 and the EXPS3. The primary difference between them is that the EXPS3 has night vision, the EXPS2 does not. Now there are -0, -2, -4 after those model variants, and that refers to the number of dots that are in the reticle. I don't know if you can see this or not, but this one has 2 dots. This is the EXPS2-2. Because of that, the 2-4 model has 4 dots, and you would use those for bullet drop compensation, but most folks that I know out there don't really use the BDC options because, frankly, it does not work unless it's that very specific ammunition, very specific barrel and barrel length that was used to test the BDCs. But in general, they do work. They're just not as precise as you adjusting on your own. Now, between these, there's also the XPS models. The XPS models sit at a absolute co-witness height, while these, with the quick detach levers on them, as you can see here, they quick detach off, and then you would mount and click back on. These examples here are lower 1/3, and they physically sit a smidge higher. That being said, going back to what I refer to for night vision shooting, or even if you want a taller optic height for a more neutral heads-up display through the optic, Unity Tactical, among other companies out there, make a riser rail for your optic to sit on top of. And there you go. The EOTech is now sitting on top of the Unity riser, and now it sits at the same height as the Aimpoint on the Unity Tactical micro riser here. These are known as their fast mounts, and they're an excellent option for you if you like that height of optic. It's up to you to decide what works best for you. Moving on from the EOTechs, we're going to go over the tube style red dots here. Now, between the Aimpoints, why would you want this one over this one? Well, weight savings, but you do gain a lot more robustness with the higher material that occurs on the Aimpoint Pro or the ACO versus the Aimpoint T2 or the H2 models. The primary difference between the Aimpoint T and H models is that the T has night vision settings, the H doesn't. They're roughly around the same price, maybe $100 of difference. So frankly, just get the T2 versions. Now, understanding that the T1, the predecessor, the T1 and the H1, they have a little bit older technology, so the dot is not as crisp. And even under magnification, sometimes you can see a smear instead of a crisp dot. Going to the Holosuns, they are a good, affordable option for you to use on the range. Granted, they're not as proven as the Aimpoint variants out there, but it is an option for you, especially if you're in that more budget-minded territory. You understand that you're not necessarily using these optics for hard use, so it's an option. Just don't expect it to be quote-unquote just as good as the rest of these, because frankly, they're not. They're not as proven, but the technology is always continuously improving. So we never know what's going to happen in the next few years, but understand that they work, but I personally wouldn't use these on any heavy use guns. You can see that they're very similar in design, that realistically Holosun copied the footprint, but granted, a lot of other companies out there have copied this micro footprint because it's so successful. They use the same style of battery, and even the accessories are similar. So the mounting pattern is an Aimpoint pattern itself. So anything that this optic can mount on, this optic can mount on. Scalarworks versus Unity, that's totally your call. The Scalarworks mounts have this little ratcheting system for quick detach. The Unity system, or at least this specific variant, does not, but you can get American Defense Manufacturing quick detach mounts should you want that. I personally didn't see a need for a QD for this particular optic for my setup because I'm using the iron sights underneath to match my front sight. So because of that, the QD wasn't as necessary. From here, we're going to segue towards magnifiers. Now, should you get a magnifier? Well, that's up to you. This essentially bridges the gap for red dots to LPVOs, or low power variable optics. And in this case, currently here, what's good out there are 3 powers. EOTech has come out with a 5 power, and Aimpoint has a 6 power, but frankly, that's really old technology and is not a very good 6 power magnifier. This is the Aimpoint 3XC, and this one is the EOTech G33. Between these two, the G33 wins because this Aimpoint 3XC is considered as the civilian version versus their military grade or their duty grade 3 power magnifier. Now, note that the EOTech magnifier flips to the side and your optic is here. What that allows you to do is to clear your optic, but you create this now snag hazard that goes on the side. And to combat that, what Unity has done is your optic flips up and down from your sight picture. So imagine your optic is here, it flips up, and it's now in line with your optic. But once you fold it down, now it's closing out of the way for your optic, and your optic is using at 1 power. And there's no snag hazard like on the flip to the side examples here. Now, why would you want one over the other? Well, that's up to you to decide. Scalarworks also has their own flip to the side magnifier that works with their height of mount, while the Unity Tactical version specifically works with a 2.26 height here. In this case, you have to use their mount or an equivalent height mount for your viewing window to work when you're running magnified. Now, understanding that, the Holosun's, the style of body itself is physically a little bit taller than on the Aimpoints. So if you're running a 1.93 like this and you are intending to use the Scalarworks 1.93 flip to the side magnifier mount, note that the Aimpoint sits a little bit lower in comparison to the Holosun, or I should say that the Holosun footprint sits a smidge taller, so this would be closer to a 2-inch than a true 1.93. So your magnifier may not necessarily line up with that. So just be cognizant of that situation. Now, red dots come with a primary flaw with people who have astigmatism. The way that our eyes pick up light for folks who have astigmatism can vary by person to person. Sometimes people see a dot just like people who don't have astigmatism, if their astigmatism is mild enough. Sometimes people see a starburst. Sometimes people see multiple dots, multiple starbursts. Sometimes people see a smear or a cluster blob. And I'll try to link in photos of examples of what people with astigmatism see. Everybody's eyes are going to be different. Some optics do a little bit better with astigmatism than others. The EOTechs, giving their laser technology, is already naturally fuzzy in comparison to the red dot. That being said, you're not supposed to be staring at the reticle of an EOTech or even on a red dot. You're supposed to be staring at the target and superimposing the reticle onto the target, just like with the red dot. Now, where it comes into a factor is if you're intending to use the reticle for precise shooting or precise aiming. Now, you're going to have more of a problem depending on your astigmatism level. What the reticle looks like when you're looking through it, if you have astigmatism, may completely occlude the target itself, and you may not be able to find that precise aiming point that you want. So there are workarounds to that, depending on what the reticle looks like when you view it. If you have a starburst or any other type of consistent pictures, consistent blob, whatever it may be, the recommendation is that you find a point of reference and you zero the precise shooting based off that point that you're looking at, and then you use the rest of the reticle or the blob or whatever you got going on as the CQB reticle itself. So that's up to you to figure out what works for you, but that is a general recommendation. EOTech's giving the holographic technology. So what people see with an EOTech is pretty much what people with astigmatism see. Now, as far as red dots, that's where those recommendations that I noted come into play. Granted, as I noted earlier before, the differences between the T2 versus the older T1, people with astigmatism have reported that the T1s are worse, far worse, and the T2s have gotten so much better. I do have mild astigmatism, and for me, I see a starburst when I'm looking through a T2, when I'm looking through the Aimpoint Pro, and when I'm looking through the Holosun. I have not personally looked through a T1, so I cannot verify how much more of a difference of sight picture that I see. That being said, the moment that you throw on a magnifier, it essentially turns your red dot or your holographic sight into a prism optic. And what I mean by prism is, a prism is essentially what scopes do technically, and it clears up the reticle. So the starburst that you saw should turn into a dot, and the fuzzy reticle should clear up a little bit. But again, EOTechs are designed to be a little bit fuzzy anyways. So that is an option for you when shooting at distance or looking for that more precise shot, is you can use that starburst for mid to close range shooting. And then once you start pushing it towards that mid to high tier, then you can throw on your magnifier and then go from there. Red dots and magnifiers out of the way, we're going to go ahead and get into low power variable optics, or LPVOs. I have 3 examples here. This one being an EOTech Vudu 1/6 power. This is a Vortex Razor 1/6. And this is a primary A.R.M.S 1/6. I think this is their SLX. These 2 examples are second focal plane, and this one is first focal plane. What does that mean? Well, a second focal plane optic keeps the same sight picture regardless of magnification level. While on our first focal plane, as you zoom in, the reticle physically gets larger as you're zooming in towards the target. Well, on a second focal plane optic itself, you zero at the highest magnification. Especially if you have a bullet drop compensation on there, it will only work at the power that you zeroed at. While on our first focal plane optic, once you zero the optic itself, it doesn't matter what magnification setting you're at. The bullet drop compensation, or at least the lines of the reticle itself, will still function. There's pros and cons to both of those. Typically, first focal plane, I usually don't recommend unless you are using a higher powered optic beyond an LPVO. For LPVOs, first focal plane is not as beneficial. The purpose of a low power variable optic is for you to use the scope at one power settings, while at the same time being able to zoom into whatever power that it goes to for you to positively identify a target, which is known as PID. That comes with a trade-off. Some scopes do better at the higher end magnification range, and some scopes do better at the one power range, but it can't do both. You're going to lose a little bit here and there depending on what you're doing. A lot of the scopes that are out there are not true one power, just like viewing through a red dot. And that's just a limitation of the technology. You're always going to get some form of quasi fishbowl effect when looking through one power. Granted, a lot of scopes do a very good job at the 1x setting, like the Vortex Razor. The field of view is very good on the Vortex Razor. On the high end at 6 power, between all these three optics, you sort of go into that whole toilet paper roll effect where you get a little bit of tunnel vision through there. While the contrast is on a high power variable optic that's already set, let's say a 4 to 12 optic, you have much better field of views on the 4 power and the 12 power setting because they're already at that high end magnification range. Now, why would you want a low power variable optic over the red dot with the magnifier? Both the low power variable optic setups as well as the red dot with the magnifier setups come with the weight penalty. Both of them are heavy. Depending on which options you go for, one might be slightly heavier or lighter than the other. And that's up for you to determine what's more beneficial to you in that point. What you gain in the low power variable optic setting is better eye relief because the scopes were designed for that specific purpose. While on the red dot plus magnifier setting, the red dots are always amazing at one power, but once you throw on a red dot, you get very short eye relief. And what that means is where your eye box is in relation to the magnifier or the ocular lens in this case for the scopes. And on the 1 to 6s, or at least the low power variable optics like these here, your eye relief is much, much better at 1x. Granted, once you zoom in magnification, it might be closer. But on the magnifiers for the red dots themselves, they're almost always nose to charging handle. What that means is you're pretty much butt up like this just to use the magnifier. And frankly, there's a lot more scope shadow that comes with 3x magnifiers. So the LPVOs do a better job at that particular style of setup. Now, there are a lot of reticle options in these categories, and frankly, that's a lot to get into. I'm not going to do that, but there are other channels out there that do an excellent job at specific reviews on independent optics themselves. Superset CA being one of them, and I'll go ahead and screenshot his channel here for you to follow him. Fantastic channel, very objective and very reasonable. He tests a variety of products from low range to high end optics, as well as 9-hole reviews. Henry and Josh out there, they do an excellent job at practical accuracy as well as a practical application of the optics that are being tested. And I'll link their channel here for you too. With all of that out of the way, if you decide on a low power variable optic, the same applies for optic height. So which height do you choose? Well, that's largely up to you. Whether it be you tend to shoot more on the high power range or on the short power range, that's your call. Now, the pros and cons to both is that with a lower 1.52 or even lower height mount, you get that more consistent cheek weld for more consistent shots at distance. The downside to it is your neck is a little bit more kinked up as you're trying to find your target. The pro to the higher optic height mounts is that your neck is less strained. You have a lot more neutral heads up display, and you have a lot more situational awareness as you're looking around. And those excel at shooting at close range, or in this case, if you have a night vision device with a scope. Some people do that, and that's up to you to determine if that's right for you. But understanding that, we're going to go ahead and go into some of the scope mount options that are out there. Traditionally, when mounting scopes, you would use rings. And they're independent two-piece rings, which is essentially one of these mounts, but less the base on the bottom. And they independently tighten onto the 1913 rail on the top of your receiver, which is this up here. And you have the option to set it where you need to in relation to the scope body. And that's a nice feature to have. You can also pick varying heights if you want to help you get that more consistent cheek weld to your liking. The downside to them is that they're not going to be as robust as one-piece units like this, because you have a stronger base that supports the ring themselves to the correct height that you want. Now, classically, these style of scope mounts were available, and these are known as cantilevers, meaning they're pushed out a little bit further for particularly mounting scopes. For the rings, sometimes you're limited to the amount of rail space that you have, and ideally, you want the scope to be set at the proper level for you and your particular eye relief, but sometimes you run out of space. So what the cantilever mounts like these do is they push the optic forward to allow you more space back here, so you can run it a little bit more flush to your receiver. I personally use cantilevers. I will use the independent rings for, let's say, bolt action rifles or rifles without a dedicated flat top. One of the styles of scope mounts uses these. They call them quick detach, but they're not really quick detach. Is once you apply the mount onto your flat top, you would essentially screw these down and torque them down, and they're not coming off. So these are very, very tough, very sturdy, but you lack that quick detach function should you want that. I personally don't have a problem with these, but they tend to be a little bit heavier, especially this particular one is loopholed, and it's definitely a beefy, chunky scope mount. There are different materials out there, steel or aluminum, and it's your call to determine what you want. Obviously, the steel ones are going to be more robust than the aluminum ones. I'm not saying that aluminum isn't strong, depending on who engineers it, but it's just something to consider out there. My preference is not to have these types. I do prefer the quick detach to some degree. We have the American Defense Manufacturing scope mounts here. These are quick detach by lever. As I mentioned earlier, on the Unity Tactical mounts itself, you can acquire a ADM or American Defense Manufacturing quick detach lever to replace this section here, and it'll give you quick detachability should you want that. I have found personally that the American Defense Manufacturing scope mounts are fantastic for the price. Right now they're approximately $200 or so. This is specifically the Recon, and it is pushed forward a little bit. Granted, if you notice this one sits much lower, this is a 1.52, which is traditional AR height. I have found that the ADM mounts are much more repeatable as far as returning to zero should you remove your optic on and off. Now, why would you want a quick detach? Well, the general argument is that if your optic goes down, if it breaks somehow, then you can quick detach it and use your iron sights. Whether or not that is beneficial to you is up to you to decide. You just have to think practical about it. If you are using this in theater or it's for duty use, then that might be something to consider. If you are a recreational shooter, it may not be necessary. Frankly, a lot of the recreational shooters that I know of that do put backup iron sights on their scopes, frankly, have never used their iron sights other than the initial zero. So something to consider there. The other option that we have is the Scalarworks mount. Like the Scalarworks red dot mount, it has this quick detach ratcheting system here. In addition, it has a self-leveling screw down here. And what you do is once you mount your optic in it, you would screw this down and torque it, and it basically flattens out and levels the scope for you. Then you torque everything down and back that screw out. I purposely left mine here because I know if I took it out that I'd probably lose it somewhere. So it just sits inside the scope mount body. I like the Scalarworks system, but it is probably about $100 more expensive than the ADMs. And bang for buck wise, the ADMs win in my opinion. But granted, I still use Scalarworks because I found that the engineering behind it and the robustness of the Scalarworks mounts is superb. So if you notice the height differences between the two, this one is a 1.52 as I noted earlier, while this one is a 1.93 mount. I prefer the taller height depending on what I'm doing. In this case, this LPVO serves as a primarily one power with the ability to go up, so I choose to have this. While this optic here serves as more of a dedicated prone shooting or bench style shooting. Which height you go for is totally up to you. My recommendation is to try both. Mount the optic and then move your head up and down. to see what's more natural for you as you're moving around, assuming you're shooting at 1 power, and then try the same thing at bench or prone shooting, see what's more comfortable and consistent for you. Ultimately, it's up to you to decide. I'm just simply providing data points for you. If you notice, both of these scopes here, they have cattails or scope levers, and that helps you to turn the dial a little bit faster than you would if you use the knurling by itself. Some scopes like this Vortex Razor, it's very stiff, and this is pretty much mandatory. The primary A.R.M.S one, it's pretty smooth. I don't really need it, but it certainly is there to help. While the EOTech Vudu has an option for you to screw in this little lever, and I leave it on. I like it. In this case here, the whole entire ocular portion itself turns with the optic. That's pretty much it for part 3 of the AR Primer series, going over optics and considerations when choosing your optics. This is by no means an in-depth overview of what to look for, and only serves as a primer to get you started. As I noted earlier, there are other channels out there that do far better jobs and provide much more in-depth information on not only the considerations that we're talking about here, but also on individual overviews or reviews of specific optic choices out there. I recommend that you seek this information out to further help you decide what works best for you. Take all the information with a grain of salt and come to your own conclusions. If what somebody tells you, including me, does not make sense to you, and they cannot justify how what they're telling you benefits you in any way, then you probably shouldn't listen to them. That's all for this portion of the video series. I hope you guys enjoyed it. I hope it was informative. Please go ahead and like, comment, subscribe, and share this information with anyone who you think that it could help. Thank you for tuning in. Bunny Operator signing out.